Good afternoon and welcome. It's my pleasure to open today's conference organized by the International Center for Law and Econ and the EU Legal Studies Research Center of the University of Liège on a topic as vital and as complex as the future of merger control. First, let me thank each and every one of you for being here today. And let me acknowledge also our speakers. Their experience spans academia, regulatory bodies, legal and economic practice, and we are grateful for the time and insight today. The title of the session, Squaring the Circle, is deliberately provocative. It captures the difficult balancing act the EU merger control faces today, stuck in between the need for legal certainty, evolving economic theories, and the political imperatives of strategic autonomy and market resilience. As you know, the EU Commission is now reviewing its horizontal merger guidelines. The goal of this review is to make sure that the framework remains fit for purpose amid digitalization, AI, a new trend in international relationships, and the need to tackle climate change. At the heart of this review lies a simple but crucial question: how can merger control remain robust, predictable, and economically sound, while also taking into account the strategic priorities that have emerged over the past decade? These are not abstract questions. They have concrete, direct impact on how companies structure transactions, on how investors assess the regulatory risks, and how major authorities will apply competition rule. So our panels today will try to discuss this tension and explore a possible way forward. So without further ado, I'm glad to introduce Mr. Axel de Smet, the president of the Belgian Competition Authority, who has accepted to deliver the keynote speech, and we look forward for a constructive discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you, Normand, for the introduction, and thanks to the University of Liège Institute of EU Legal Studies and the International Center for Law and Economics for inviting me to bring this keynote speech. I'm honored to be invited by such distinguished organizations that help promoting the study of competition law and policy. The mission statement of the International Center for Law and Economics reads as follows on your website. Our mission is to promote the use of law and economics methodologies to inform public policy debates. We believe that intellectual, rigorous, data-driven analysis will lead to efficient policy solutions that promote consumer welfare and global economic growth. End quote. Not only do I fully support such mission statements, but I also think it is the right time to pause for a minute and to reflect on the privilege that we have in Europe to be able to conduct policy on a scientific and rational basis to the benefit of the greater good. I would add that we do this grounded on strict procedural requirements and through institutions that are independent and institutionally shielded from political interference. These are essential components for a legitimate and predictable merger control regime. In a changing world, however, these principles are being challenged or even threatened, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not. I will try to address both situations. To begin with, compared to the time when merger control was introduced, the world has changed, fundamentally changed. Several other objectives next to consumer welfare that you mentioned in your website and mission statement have become equally, if not more important. To name a few that will also be the topic of discussions today: one, resilience; both the COVID crisis and the geopolitical conflicts acted like a violent wake-up call for Europe's need for resilience. 2. Sustainability amidst escalating climate crises. The scientific consensus around global warming has clarified that man's greatest challenge will be to act together against a global application of the prisoner's dilemma. 3. Security and trade. Multilateralism and rule-based international order is threatened, and the global economic growth, as mentioned again in your mission statement, does not seem to be an obvious shared objective anymore. To these objectives, one should add the economic scan that was realized by the Draghi report and which highlighted a sense of urgency for Europe to scale up innovation and European competitiveness. While we as competition authorities are not in the driver's seat for achieving any of those objectives, and this is often forgotten, it is clear that we must do all we can to contribute to these objectives. At the same time, we have to be wary of disingenuous usage of these objectives in a merger context. An illustration of this occurrence was yet again on the table with the Evian letter of the 46 CEOs in the Franco-German meeting blaming competition law as it, I quote, often hinders the creation of European champions. As mentioned, competition authorities are not in the driver's seat for achieving these objectives, and we should certainly not be considered the scapegoat for the inability to address one or several of these challenges. To be clear, there is nothing in merger control that is contradictory to achieving or caring for these objectives. Still, merger control practice can and should evolve, or at the very least be clarified to explain how and to what extent competition authorities can take account of these objectives. And this is precisely one of the goals of the merger guidelines review that was started this summer on the initiative of the Commission. The merger guidelines are an essential tool both for merging parties and for competition authorities. They bring legal certainty and they help parties to pre-assess transactions in early stages. The guidelines certainly help the Belgian Competition Authority when reviewing a merger. To give you an example, the Belgian Competition Authority used the guidelines notably in a merger occurring in a highly regulated hospital sector in Belgium. While I don't think there are many examples, if any, in the guidelines on this sector, the Belgian Competition Authority was able to use the guidelines and its framework for those aspects where competition was still at play between hospitals, notably on doctor and room supplements, which are still in competition. I could give other examples, but what I want to say is that we are very satisfied with the guidelines. As mentioned, however, the world is changing and the guidelines should also evolve. In this regard, coming back to the issue of European competitiveness, one of the aspects where we would welcome further clarification in the guidelines is innovation. More specifically, the measurement of innovation effects in a merger analysis. Mergers can arguably both stimulate or reduce investment and innovation. Scale and innovation are now becoming the alpha and omega of competition in certain sectors. It is therefore essential to have guidance on how to assess such innovation in a merger context. Likewise, balancing innovation in the medium term versus price increases or other competitive harms in the short term could potentially also require further clarification. This may require balancing uncertainty for future events with mechanical short-term effects. A difficult exercise, certainly for a practice area such as ours, that ought to be based on facts and data. Forward-looking theories of harm make merger procedure outcomes less predictable unless legal standards and evidentiary standards are clearly defined. Next to innovation, I want to say a word on the issue of European champions. as the Evian letter puts it yet again on the agenda. So, does merger control hinder the emergence of European champions? No, it does not. Most mergers are approved, and the actual hindrance of the emergence of European champions is yet to be proven when talking about facts and data. The most cited case in this regard is Alstom Siemens, which led to the creation of 2 European champions instead of 1, as we all know by now. The one area where this argument is most heard is in the telecoms sector, a sector I know quite well after having been heading the telecoms regulator in Belgium for 14 years. The argument goes that Europe has hundreds of telecom operators for a single market, while the United States only has 3. First, this is wrong. The US also has hundreds of local carriers. Second, we have no single market for telecoms. Most telecoms markets are national or even regional. The market follows the infrastructure coverage or the existence of service competition. Still, in this area, even the Draghi report is asking for a changed approach by defining a European market for telecommunications. As much as I would like there to be a European market for telecommunications, I disagree with this proposal. In an intellectually rigorous, data-driven analysis, I'm going back to your mission statement, markets are defined on the basis of economic principles, not on the basis of a political decision. If supply and demand do not meet at European level or at global level, there is no geographical market on that level. If you want to change things in this regard, the starting point is to allocate spectrum at a European level, not at a national level. And this has nothing to do with merger control. Thus, I am unconvinced by the claim of the largest telecom incumbents in Europe that we need to be more flexible on merger control to allow the development of European telecommunications champions. Problematic mergers in this area mostly, if not only, relate to in-country mergers that would have the exact opposite effects of the creation of a single market. A larger national market share or fewer players on that market will not create, as by magic, a European market, or even less so, a global market. Markets exist where demand and supply meet, not where a business lobby would like it to be. Allowing consolidation at the expense of competition will not suddenly make Europe less vulnerable to Chinese or US operators who are not present in Europe on these markets. I note, by the way, that the current stated challenges in that sector as regards investment for rollout of fiber and 5G networks can be met also by other means that are less restrictive of competition than an outright merger which eliminates competition between the merging parties. I refer to cooperation agreements between operators, infrastructure sharing, or joint rollout agreements, which can be an alternative route to mergers in order to square the circle of investment in a stagnating market. You can read our press release of today in this regard, which is quite topical. This being said, I do think that there can be tension between overall scale benefits resulting from consolidation when balanced against the negative impacts of a merger on competition on a local level. To give you an example, a merger may fundamentally reinforce the buying power or the investment capacity of the merged parties on a national, pan-national, or European level, or even a global level, while at the same time reducing competition on local markets where both parties are competing with each other prior to the merger. This may touch upon the famous question of out-of-market efficiencies. This issue may become relevant in the context of a discussion on achievements of the earlier mentioned objectives such as resilience, security, and sustainability. In the context of the resilience debate, for example, a merger may increase resilience for the EU as a whole or in one specific market while harming price competition on another market or on a more local market. There should be no misunderstanding, however. Our mandate as a national competition authority is to focus on competition on our national market while making sure that we promote a European single market. A European single market does not imply, however, that competition in smaller markets should be sacrificed in order to allow European champions to measure their profits with those of companies outside Europe. Be that as it may, many of these issues could be addressed in the review of the merger guidelines. It should help us all to better identify how the changing world can be considered in our merger reviews. These are examples of the good reasons to challenge the merger review practice. We have also different challenges, however, and the most alarming ones relate to the independence of competition authorities, which is yet again a reason of concern in major jurisdictions. We all read articles on what is happening in this regard, so I don't have to go into the details of certain cases that are the object of specialized press reports. What I would like to do in this context, however, is to positively praise the current system in Europe, which is, as mentioned earlier, facts and data-driven and protected by fundamental rights of due process. Yes, we do have our disagreements with parties. But these disagreements are transparent and based on a rational exchange of arguments. They are duly exposed in the decisions that are being adopted, and as such, they can be challenged in court and more generally criticized by anyone. As an administrative authority, we will, of course, take due account of the court's case law, and we will also listen to experts' criticism. Similarly, in a multilateral cooperative environment where several competition authorities are working on similar issues, we also inspire and learn from each other, including from each other's mistakes. This cooperative framework for competition authorities is also what we promote outside Europe within the OECD and the ICN. We also promote this in bilateral exchanges with countries that do not necessarily have the same legal traditions as we have. So it's essential for me to insist on these values for adequate merger control regime that is legally sound and predictable for all stakeholders. Nothing is worse than undisclosed, obscure dealings to approve mergers. In the same vein, we should be careful to protect the analytical framework of merger review to the one we should be focusing on, competition law and policy. Merger approvals should not be based on other considerations. If I would have said this 15 years ago, people in the room would have asked why I'm saying this. Today, I'm sure everybody knows. Thus, let me conclude by praising the work of both University of Liège Institute of EU Legal Studies and of the International Center of Law and Economics in helping to promote an intellectually rigorous, data-driven analysis for competition law practice. Today, more than ever, we need institutions like you to support such an approach, and the conference of today is a fine example of such endeavor. I wish you all a very interesting day.
Thank you very much for those introductory remarks, Axel. As you rightly pointed out, the world is facing unprecedented both crises, but also opportunities. So there's global warming. We see also the emerging dominance of China in sort of industrial manufacturing and the geopolitical issues that entails. There is also, what was I going to say? Opportunities in the shape of generative AI and what that may do for human productivity. Now, the question for today is, and for this panel more specifically, is how does that affect or relate to competition merger control? And in that respect, I'm reminded of two quotes from two different people. The first is from Jean Monnet, who said that Europe is forged in crisis. But the second is from Friedrich Hayek, who says that the curious task of economics is to teach people how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. And so I guess the question for our panelists today is, should Europe forge, or should it be careful about what it thinks it can design? And so to discuss these issues, I have four very distinguished panelists. The first is Daniele Caristi, who's the head of the merger policy unit at DG Competition. Second is Jeffrey Manny, who's the president and founder of ICLE, but also a professor at IE Law School in Madrid, We then have Ingrid van den Boer, who's a partner at Skadden, and David Bosco, who's a professor of competition law at the University of Aix-Marseille. We'll start with a short introduction by Daniel Calisti, and I'm sure it will be a great discussion.
Thank you, Dirk, and to the University of Liège. Actually, ironically, Liège was the first Belgian city I visited when I was an Erasmus student, and I came to visit my friends who were at the university. So I have fond memories of the student life in Liège from 20-something years ago. And I think that this conversation today comes at a very momentous time for the reform drive in Europe concerning mergers. And I think after Axel spoke, I would think that my intervention is almost redundant because I can subscribe to everything that he just said. Let me just clarify that I speak in a personal capacity, as usual. But I think that what I can do is to try to a bit frame the debate based on what the ultimate objective of this review is, and also taking the challenge of answering your question whether we should forge or we should be careful about what we do. And I think that there's a way to reconcile what you mentioned, the societal challenges that we have, and at the same time the role that we have, which is enshrined in a text, which is the merger regulation, which is not up for review. We should remind that. I think that the basic law that governs merger control at the EU level is not up for reform at this stage. What we're trying to do is to review the rules that define, ex ante how the Commission applies its discretion when it applies these rules to a number of economic sectors, which make these rules very important. But let me already start from a consideration. I think, sometimes, when you see that the review of the merger guidelines is being quoted in every big event where people say about, what are the big challenges for Europe, etc. It's a bit daunting to think that, there's a lot of expectation that the review of a non-binding text of the Commission will fix everything. Spoiler, it will not. So why are we here to do this review? And I think that Axel reminded a bit of challenges. You also, Dirk, mentioned some en passant, but I think that the world has changed enormously since we did this 20 years ago. What has not changed is the objective of merger control. So where we should be careful not to pass a message that merger control can do everything is to say, okay, from tomorrow, we will have a fundamental rethink of what we are here to do. Because one, it's not what's on the table. And number two, also from a democracy perspective, and the Vice President Ribera has made this forceful pitch, I think we give ourselves rules to adjudicate certain interests in society, and these are done by legislators, by elected officials, and all of that. And those rules are there, and we have to apply those rules. So these objectives do not change. So what is the scope for reform that we have given ourselves? I think merger control, like many branches of competition enforcement, but more than others in the sense that it has to deal with certain market dynamics, and it has to try to assess how this can develop in the future or how a transaction can impact on them looking forward. Well, then there's the realization that these market dynamics have fundamentally shifted in a lot of respects in reaction to certain epochal challenges that we face, certain changes in market structures, in the way that certain industries have developed. And I think that is instead what we have to look at with an open mind to understand a bit how these realities have changed and how merger control, which is rooted in market realities, has to define these parameters. And some of them you have mentioned, and I will not dwell on because it's beyond today's discussion, but to take the example that you gave on sustainability, essentially. There's been a big debate in town whether now that's a new objective that we need to have for competition enforcement, whether we should legislate on that, etc. Whereas what happened while we were having this debate is that we had certain cases, certain merger cases, where the Commission had to look at the market characteristics in certain industries, including heavy industries, where sustainability had become a parameter of competition. It was a parameter of demand. It was something relevant on how suppliers structure their production processes and how they offer their products. So it was becoming something important in how the market performs. So it was legitimate for us to look at it in those cases. The only challenge is that in the guidelines we didn't write 20 years ago how this could happen, because we could not see that happening, right? So it is time now and we have this opportunity to try to set in a bit more systematic fashion, and to give also a bit more of a predictable framework to stakeholders on how we intend to do this on a number of challenges. And let me mention three specifically that were part of the broad public consultation we had over the summer. And these are single market and competitiveness, innovation, and resilience. And they will be discussed a bit more in depth today. But if I can just briefly frame the debate on, why I would single these out and why they were singled out in the consultation. On single market and the competitiveness of the single market, I think, everybody thinks that it's something very new. Actually, if you look at the recitals of the merger regulation, one of the opening recitals is precisely about that. Merger control is very much linked to the single market and to the competitiveness of European companies. And there is this idea at the very beginning of the merger regulation, when we set the recitals where we explain why we are doing this at the EU level, that this is why we're doing it. And in the literature, there's a lot of discussion about the enforcement gap. I mean, we wanted to give ourselves a regulation in 2004 because we needed to cover those cases that were not dominants and so on and so forth. But also, there was a big discussion that started in 1989, which was about, should we, as we try to develop a market that is deeper and more integrated, have a control of transactions that can be transformative at the EU level rather than, only at the national level or not at all, so that you have a one-stop shop where this transaction is reviewed. And in the recitals to the merger regulation, we wrote, essentially, they wrote at the time that, as the market becomes more integrated, we will have more corporate restructurings because companies will try to gain scale because they will become bigger in this bigger market. And that's something that one of the reasons why we want to have merger control at the EU level. So this going to the root of the merger regulation to understand what is the impact of merger control on this set of problems is not something new. It's actually going back to its origins. Now, whether we have fulfilled the promise of a single market, of like something that is a larger market where companies can become larger without having without gaining market power, I mean, is a topic for debate, and I'm sure we'll come back to it later. Then there's the innovation and dynamic competition angle, and I think that is the one of the key axis of the reform that we have started, because obviously we have realized that starting from our enforcement, that innovation is an important parameter of competition. Again, it's nothing new. It's in our guidelines, but we don't speak much about it. Sometimes it's a shorthand, or we refer to it to say that price is a shorthand for all parameters, and what we do for price is also applies to innovation. And what our case practice has shown is that there's some due attention to be paid to innovation and how this plays a role in the competition analysis, which today is not in the guidelines. If you read certain cases that are in our rule books, you find a lot more, I would say, intellectual apparatus and reflection on how innovation can be considered when you assess, when you do a competitive analysis on a merger, than there is in our guidance. So I think it is the moment to think about it in a more holistic way, both in the negative and in the positive, on the negative effects of a merger and the positive effect of mergers on innovation, and to set these out in a general framework ex ante. I will not go more in depth. I think we will now have a bit of a more interactive discussion, but I just wanted to say a couple of final words on the consultation we had over the summer, because I think in the field of mergers, I cannot speak for all the fields of antitrust enforcement, but it was a bit unprecedented because we had around 250 replies. We had both the general and the targeted consultations, and people responded to both, but overall the responses came from 200 different entities, representing a lot of different industries and type of stakeholders, and coming from all member states in the union. So I think it's been a broad exercise. We will publish the results in the coming weeks, and I think what you will see is that on certain key parameters there's a healthy debate among stakeholders on which is the direction of travel that we should take. But what is very interesting, and I go back to something that Axel said in the presentation, is that what everybody agrees on is you have to do something that is, well thought, because if you reopen these merger guidelines and you do something that, is just a generic or just stating certain objectives, but stakeholders don't understand how to apply these rules, then you will do a disservice to everybody. So you have to keep them sound and you have to keep them predictable. And that is the difficult challenge that comes now, but I think we'll come back on it in the rest of this debate.
Hello. Oh, great, it's on. Thank you very much, Daniele, for those thoughtful remarks. I think that raises, as far as I can tell, at least 3 sort of big buckets of issues we could talk about. And to my mind, maybe the first one is on resilience and the intersection between resilience and competition enforcement. Does competition enforcement have something to say in this respect? And if so, what? I'm going to ask the other panelists to chime in. Perhaps, Jeff, you can take a first stab at this complicated question.
Sure. We good? Yeah. Thanks, Dirk. Thanks, Axel. That was a really interesting talk. And like with Daniele, you preempted much of what I was going to say. So we should all just go have a drink, I think. I want to make a little bit of a somewhat broader comment than just about resilience, because it sort of applies to everything we're going to talk about today, and then I'll focus on resilience. And I think you anticipated this as well. I think that there is an opportunity, there's a place for these concepts that are, in fact, largely, at least nominally, outside of the scope of what we usually consider part of merger review, to be part of the discussion when you think about dynamic analysis, when you think about longer time frames, and you think about how to structure a business, or what sort of products a business should produce, or what sort of investments it should make, and the like, to position itself for future competition. I think you then, it's an opportunity to think about these other issues. And of course, saying that, you have to immediately add, and of course, it's also an opportunity to abuse that. And so, as Axel also pointed out, that's, sort of where the tension arises. So on resiliency in particular, I think maybe the best way to think about that, and this could apply to all of the topics we'll talk about today, is in terms of sort of what efficiencies are going to be cognizable in a merger review, or what sort of efficiencies defense will you allow. So the example I always like to use to sort of set the table is the Alston case, not the one you guys know, the U.S. Alston versus NCAA case, not a merger case, but I would just bear with me for a moment. This is effectively the case that said the NCAA can't do. The National Collegiate Athletic Association. This is the organization that sort of. I'm not a sports guy, so I'm going to mess this up. That runs sports for colleges I don't know. So yeah, you know what I mean. So the NCAA was engaged in some conduct that the plaintiff said was anti-competitive. The court agreed. Its defense was all of this conduct that you're challenging is in the service of amateurism in sports. So the difference between the NCAA and the NFL and the MLB and the like, Major League Baseball, is that they're professional, they get paid for what they're doing, and the athletes who participate at the college level are amateurs. The court basically said, to hell with your amateurism. That's just not a good enough excuse for engaging in what you're doing. And it begs the question, what is a good enough excuse? So is sustainability going to be okay? What if a company is engaging in conduct that looks potentially anti-competitive, but they say, but this is important for sustainability? In the context of resiliency, you could imagine exactly the same sort of thing. What if a merger might, as Axel pointed out, might have some short-term, potentially negative effects on, say, price, especially looking at consumers, but the merging parties say this is important for us to be able to be resilient against future shocks and to enable long-term competition. And Axel is right. We don't have a good, well-defined mechanism for how we trade off those alternatives. I think we can all agree that they're all benefits. I mean, again, they could be manipulating the system, and they could actually be an excuse for something really bad. But there's obviously a benefit there, and there's obviously would be potentially a benefit to lowering prices in the short term. Short of just ignoring that long-term potential efficiency, how do we weigh those against each other?
That's a great segue for the other panelists. Like we have, we may have these instances where there's a trade-off. Should enforcers either focus on areas where there is no trade-off between these different values, or if they do focus on cases where there is a trade-off, what instruments should we bring to bear to weigh those things? Maybe we'll circle back to Daniele, but maybe first we can start with Ingrid and/or David.
So first, I would like to warmly thank you for the invitation. Hope you're not going to be disappointed, but you have to face the fact that you invited a French law professor. Being French means that my English is rusty and I am arrogant. And law professor
that's exactly
means
why we invited you.
yeah, okay. And law professor means that I'm conservative by nature, and so when I face that kind of concept, I have to admit that I'm a bit skeptical. My first comment on this would be, I don't want to spoil the party, pardon me if I'm too provocative, but my first comment was, is it really serious? Are we really talking about a new goal or something new in merger control that is seriously going to be applied by a competition law authority? I imagined a meeting with two officials in Brussels, the one saying, oh, resilience is important. Oh yes, resilience is so important. So let's put it in the merger guidelines. Okay, let's do it and see what happens. But do we have a robust definition of what resilience is that a competition authority is going to use actually to assess the effects of a merger? I have to say that I'm quite a bit skeptical about that. Let's say a merger that would enhance competitiveness of two parties and foster innovation. But this same merger is a problem for the resilience of the European economy. How are you going to combine these three goals? How are you going to create interactions between all these political objectives that have nothing to do? My second comment will be on legal certainty. We need a precise definition, but we also need to really think about the mission we want to give to competition authorities. We can reread the regulation 139. There is nothing about that kind of objectives in it. And I'm not even sure that this regulation talks about a social objective. It's about preserving the competitive process and to protect competitive process against market power. Because reorganizations of firms are a concern for the competitive process, but nothing more. So is it really the point to add new objectives? I'm not that sure. And I'm not sure that it is a task of competition law agency to do things like that. I would say, and I promise after that I'm going to be quiet, but the last thing I would like to say is that we don't change the world with guidelines. We don't change the spirit of competition law and merger control with guidelines. And I came to shiny Brussels with a message for the European Commission. Remember what happened with Article 22. We don't change merger control with guidelines. It deserves a true debate at the European Parliament and the Council, not guidelines.
Wait, I'll give Ingrid an opportunity, and then we'll circle back to Jeff, and then we'll.
I will have forgotten it by then, so that's fine.
Go first.
No.
If Ingrid,
Please,
if
go
you
ahead.
relinquish, we can let Jeff jump in quickly.
Let me ask a question that doesn't have to be answered now. That way, I won't forget it, and we can come back to it. Which is simply, I agree with you, but I don't know how you differentiate the concern, potentially incorporating a concern with resilience into merger review from the challenge of incorporating short-term effects versus long-term effects. You already have this problem, and as I said, you could maybe even reconceptualize long-term effects sometimes as innovation or resilience or something else. So I agree with not bringing something else in, but I'd like to hear how you think that we get by in the world today, where we always have that sort of time inconsistency problem, and why that's different than incorporating resiliency specifically.
I think I'm going to align with that because I'm not sure there's necessarily going to be many cases where there's a big contrast between innovation. I have to hold it closer. Okay, a little closer. Where there's going to be a big contrast between benefits for innovation and resilience. I think you'd have to come up with difficult cases to see, well, it's going to be more innovative but less resilient. So I think we're making up contradictions that may not really exist in real life, right? I think also, it also doesn't require, I think, a whole turnaround of merger control law to take some of the innovative benefits into account. Because even though many say we look at efficiencies in merger control to date, we really haven't. We really haven't looked at efficiencies at all. And so rather than saying, oh, we now have this great difficulty because now we need to incorporate these different concepts into merger control and it doesn't fit, I think we could just start by having very clear guidance on an expansive, more expansive observation of efficiencies in merger control and innovation in merger control than we are doing today. And I think if we could only do that, it would bring us very far along, bringing innovation, resilience, and all of these factors without contradicting anything. The long-term assessment, same. Some of these assessments that we see in cases only look at short-term, and then of course the outcome is very clear, but what if you look at long-term benefits? It doesn't require an overhaul of competition law or merger control to take these into account. We just have to be more open to them. And to your point of predictability, Niele, it's to have a real framework that says, here are the benefits we will be taking into account, rather than saying, we've always done this, there's no change, we've been doing this all along, and so we'll just go on the same path.
Yeah. Can I, maybe Daniele you'd like to chime in?
Just quickly on both questions, on the resilience, what it means and how we can take into account, and on the efficiencies point. I think on what it is, I mean, well, I don't have any magic definition. I can think, however, of some cases where you do have that that happening in the market, and you can take it into account as a competition authority. I mean, ultimately, what the current geopolitical environment teaches us is that in times of dire need, I mean, you can only rely on the internal market. That's something that, as a citizen, I could say. But what's interesting is that some companies are saying that too. So when you choose your supplier, the certainty, over the parameters of supply, over, whether you will receive that supply, etc., are such that you sometimes may decide to do certain choices based also on resilience considerations. And I'm not saying this because I want to be imaginative, because we want to put it in the guidelines. I'm saying this because it's an actual case that we did, where, in defining what were the competitive, the real options on the table for companies, we took into account what they told us, that, X percent, high double-digit percent of our sourcing has to come from this region, because, yes, we can wiggle with some extra, but, that is important because we cannot have our supply chain be at risk for certain things. And when that happens, that's a market feature that, of course, you can take into account as a competition authority. So that's what we tried to also put in the public consultation. I think we spelled it out with the cases where it happened. So in that respect, that's the extent to which I think we can take it into account. There can be other examples, for sure. I mean, markets are changing, supply chains are changing. We will have to, understand how this is happening, and to take it into account as a competition authority is fair. For efficiencies, point taken, I think this is not to say that, we've always done it, we just need to explain better to people what they haven't understood. No, obviously, this will be about, setting out a framework that is more comprehensive about the type of situations that you are describing. I think for the past, what is there is, it is true that it's more on the static level. When it comes, however, to dynamic efficiencies and dynamic parameters, and I'm sure we'll go into there later, I think it gets a bit more difficult, because at the moment, I think globally, I don't think that you have any authority worldwide that has basically been able to define, with some concrete rules of thumb, dynamic parameters, be it for the analysis or for the efficiencies. which doesn't mean that we won't do it. It means that we want to do it, but just not to everybody. We'll be the first global authority to do this. That's why it's so difficult, by the way, and that's why we need a bit of time to do this right. But we're happy to take the challenge and to try to do it in a pragmatic way and in a way that makes sense, also from an economic perspective.
That's great. You raised the questions of competitiveness and innovation, which is great because it's the two next things that I would like us to talk about. So maybe Ingrid, you mentioned you had some thoughts on competitiveness and merger control. I'd be happy to hear those.
Okay, so I can go first. So just thinking of all of the elements the Draghi report put forward about a year ago, competitiveness was one big element of that. And I think all of the competition lawyers were looking at the paragraphs around the innovation defense and sort of how that would change going forward. That was a big focus. We've not seen very much development or change in that, and we've sort of all raised this in our cases and have considered it, but it hasn't been quite as monumental an impact, I think, so far. Now we have the review of the merger guidelines. I think there's lots of questions as to how you bring competitiveness in, and if you need to do something that is extraordinary and change, like have political influence and input to what you're referring to. I mentioned already, I don't think that's really required. I think there are two main factors that currently make merger control reviews unpredictable and tough for innovative companies. The first is, and it's mentioned in one of the technical papers, is this presumption of harm that is currently stated in one of the papers, at least, say in these dynamic markets, when there are significant market players, we will start with a presumption of harm in certain cases. I think that is very difficult to deal with, and it doesn't allow a lot of room for competitive analysis of dynamic effects. If you start with a presumption of, I'm going to look at these markets as relatively static, I'm going to see what I have, and based on what I see and the current situation, there's a presumption of harm. Already changing that would allow a lot more openness and a lot more ability to have assessments. I think then there also needs to be a change in the evidentiary standards of efficiencies. I think if you change those two factors, you open up the ability to look at innovative effects and competitiveness in a different way, rather than having to say, we now need to changing the merger regulation to bring a new factor in that we haven't assessed. The evidentiary standard could bring in out-of-market benefits. For example, you could look to efficiencies more openly, have less evidentiary burdens of proof for companies to show efficiencies, requires some economic work. I think that's critical. So you have maybe some studies to say, what are the benefits that we're going to accept, maybe some indeed out-of-market benefits, and have that be more structured. I do worry about this single market element of being the be-all savior, because I don't think all of mergers that have innovative capabilities and that go to competitiveness would be saved by looking at it from a single market perspective. And some may actually be harmed because you'd be considering everyone's competing with everyone. And so I'm going to be much more sort of focused on areas where we would say, well, that's not really a close competition issue. Why are we now looking at this in a broad market? Because really the issue is there. So I think it's not necessarily, it would be nice from a political level to say, oh, the single market, it chimes well with an integrated Europe. Single market would bring better competition law. But I think the two elements that are probably standing in the way of having much more competitive companies and startups being able to have predictability in how they can grow is to allow these two factors to be adjusted. We have this mentioning now of this, what was it, innovation shield for startup companies that the commissioner announced. That seems very limited, actually, in application. It is for smaller startups. It's not for every company, is how it was announced. It's not clear to me why it would not apply to many companies, why it needs to be only for small startups. In many cases, investments are being made on the basis of later buyouts and later investment. And that investment is currently, I think, under the norms being challenged. Maybe I'll pause for comments, but I just want to flag two cases that underscore kind of how companies have been scared off by merger control policy to date. Think of Adobe Figma and the assessment of potential competition in that case, which was very, very far-reaching to say, okay, it would be rational for this company, being Figma, to develop in this area, we're going to therefore see it as a potential competitor because that would be the rational way this company would go forward. And we've actually seen it has looked at these developments in a few instances, where of course companies that are looking to grow will look at different areas for potential growth. That doesn't mean they're a potential competitor in each area. Again, going back to some of the presumptions. I think the second case that is a good thing to consider is Booking eTraveli, where efficiencies were a core part of the rationale for doing that merger. And I think many competition lawyers are still scratching their head thinking about how are we going to have a robust efficiency, innovation, benefits framework against the backdrop of cases like Booking eTraveli, where efficiencies were assessed in a certain manner that was looking at as creating barriers to entry as opposed to bringing innovative products to market. And so I think that needs to be reassessed if we want to have a competitiveness-based policy that will allow that, because cases like Booking eTraveli will be the opposite, I think, if you want European companies to do. And maybe I'll pause there.
That's great. Does anyone want to chime in?
Well, on competitiveness, I would say a few comments. The first one is, again, we need a definition, and we need a clear view of what we want to do with that type of concept. Imagine for a minute that this competitiveness objective is integrated in guidelines or even in the regulation. And Alstom-Siemens case show up with an open door to competitiveness arguments. Do we have a different solution in Alstom-Siemens case? I think we are going to agree on the fact that Alstom and Siemens are together a very competitive undertaking worldwide. But does it mean that we have a more competitive European economy? Because when I read the guidelines or the project that is submitted to public consultation, we are talking about competitiveness of the European economy. So how are we going to integrate this concept of competitiveness of European economy in individual cases? Is it feasible to do so? My first comment is this one, and the second one is not on substance, but on procedure. Again, do we believe that the European Commission is the right institution to lead that kind of trade-off between competitiveness and competition, where there is a conflict? I am ashamed to say that the French government and the German one asked for a political assessment of the European Commission decisions. But this is a debate that we should have on that. Who is going to assess, to evaluate the competitiveness of the European economy?
Yeah, I guess something that ties together some of the comments we've had already, going to the question of evidentiary standards in particular, is I guess it seems to me that there is in fact a difference between the Commission acting as a arm of industrial policy or undertaking competition review to further objectives that are not part of the statutes, and some of these concerns like resiliency, long-term investment, innovation as efficiencies. There's a difference, and to me, I think it's important to bear in mind or to consider that these sort of considerations are problematic bases on which to authorize the Commission to intervene in commercial conduct. They are far less problematic as a basis to justify commercial conduct happening and restrain the Commission from intervening. And I know, of course, shocking that I would say such a thing, but I do think it's worth bearing in mind that there's a real difference there. In a world of great uncertainty, where we don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. We won't even know what the resilience effects are going to be. By the way, everyone thinks resilience means we have to have multiple sources. During COVID, it was Amazon that bought ships and shipped goods from China to America, and lots of small companies would not have promoted resilience in that regard. We don't even know, with respect to, say, resilience, what's going to promote it. It's in those conditions where we have that sort of uncertainty. It seems to me that a thumb on the scale in favor of restraint by the Commission is sort of the only outcome. You have to sort of do something, right? You have to do something, either intervene or not intervene. Seems to me that when we don't know, there's a good reason to restrain the Commission from intervening. And that, that, I don't know. I think it's very important to think about those things. Now, I would expect Daniele to have a different view than I, but,
I think sometimes people expect competition authority to be there to, look into the future in their crystal ball and try to guess what will happen in the future. And then I don't think it's our job, by the way, in merger control. It is just basically we are eventually an administration that works on the basis of evidence and has to work under the law to write a well-justified decision that stand scrutiny under certain legal principles. So I'm not sure that everything that can happen in the world in the next 5 to 10 years, I could guess. Having said that, I think when we take, let's start from some of the example to go back to what Ingrid was saying before. I mean, booking is res litigiosa. It's in court, so I cannot talk about it. But Adobe Figma, it's a strange example because actually, what the Commission said it may happen actually happened. Figma did expand in certain markets after the Commission intervened in that case, and the case was ultimately abandoned. So I think, in hindsight, which is what we can have in merger control, you may say, well, actually that may be a good framework to look at these things. And when it comes to efficiencies, I agree that that the current framework doesn't tell you much about qualitative efficiencies, about long-term efficiencies, and I think that there must be a way that you can, as an economic operator, know what type of evidence the Commission expects, what are the benchmarks to assess this evidence, and what the Commission will take into account when looking into it. And that I think is an appropriate time to rethink that, and that's what we're doing. So in earnest, we are listening to what people are telling us, and we are trying to make a rational framework of it. I mean, our past track record is not necessarily a good example of that when you think of efficiencies, because what people, I want to a bit recalibrate and reframe the debate on efficiencies, because you tend to look at the few cases where there was an efficiency defense made, and you say, you're skeptical of efficiencies. Actually, the opposite argument could be that in all the cases we clear, you don't even need to get to the efficiency assessment or to assume that there are efficiencies because you don't find harm in the first place. So I think you sit on a pile of hundreds of mergers every year where we don't intervene, and many of them have efficiencies which are tangible potentially, but we don't need to just say anything about it because we don't have the problem in the first place. And when we come to looking at efficiencies explicitly, the restraint of competition authority is born of the fact that it's not like, do I believe the company or not? It's not our perspective. The perspective is I'm playing with other people's money. You deal with efficiencies where you have established harm, short-term harm, maybe, there's going to be a price increase. So you're saying that a number of people and companies are going to pay more because of this merger. So from that moment, as a competition agency, you're playing with their money. And you say, do I believe that there will be benefits that will offset what they're doing? It can be possible. We need to say more about this and the circumstances. I agree that on qualitative efficiencies, you don't find much out there. There's a decision, under the carpet, but where we did accept certain qualitative efficiencies partially in the circular economy, for instance, in Arubis Metallo. So we have some examples out there. But that's where our skepticism comes from, because we are dealing with a situation where we have already identified harm from our perspective, and now we have to tread into what can offset this harm. And in that respect, I think that there can be efficiencies, benefit that we can take into account, also of a qualitative nature. And then there's a broader set of objectives on which I agree with David's conservative position. I mean, we cannot start taking everything into account under that bucket, because essentially, redistributing wealth from one set of people to another one, I mean, it's not really what you would want competition enforcers to do. You would want your politicians to do that, right? So to conclude, yes, we will have a framework that is more long-term looking and qualitative looking on efficiency with some clearer rules on the evidence that we expect to see and a deep thought on these issues. No, it's not going to be that everything can become an efficiency now under merger control, that we're starting to put everything on the bucket, because it's not really our job.
Also out of market effects?
That's, that is something, a lot of people in the public consultation have said that, think of out of market. And we're thinking, we don't have a conclusion. I don't have a conclusion on that yet. Obviously, you could think of that, but you would have to understand a bit what are the legal constraints on doing that. It's not a question on which we have an answer yet, but I think it's something on which we are really thinking how the policy framework can develop. There's no conclusion there, but we are thinking about it.
If I could just come back on two of the points. And Figma is a good example because I'm not sure it went into any areas competing with Adobe on the areas. They grew, but they're not really competing in the space with Adobe, nor is Adobe competing on the Figma projects. So it is a very good example. Also on the price effects, you do say you need to protect citizens, consumers from price effects, but I go back to the presumption of harm. In many cases, what you've identified is a potential price effect based on an economic analysis that is only that, right? It's analysis. This assumption that, when you have a horizontal merger, necessarily there will be price increase of X percent, it's very speculative, it's presumptive. And I think there's an area where if you start from that presumption, yes, your efficiencies will have to climb a hill to overcome that. I think there also needs to be an understanding of how strong is our evidence that there will be negative effects? How strong is that really? And how comfortable are we just looking at the short term? Because that is in effect what is impeding some of these companies to grow. Because to grow, you need to look at the long term. And if you're only comfortable staying at the short term, that is going to have companies that only can operate in the short term. Right? That's one of the core problems. You cannot only facilitate operating an analysis on the short term.
Maybe the discussion here on efficiencies, it raises another point, which is when we talk about efficiencies, I think we often think in cases where you may have dynamic efficiencies, and that raises the question of mergers and innovation, which is sort of the third bucket that we said we talk about. David, do you have anything that you'd like to sort of say on that to open discussion? And maybe just one framing thing. We have a panel afterwards dedicated to innovation and how we should weave in or not the analysis of things like dynamic efficiencies in merger cases. But I think there's a sort of separate question, which is what kind of merger policy in general may be conducive to greater innovation throughout the economy?
Thank you. On innovation, I have to say that we now have more experience than with concepts such as resilience and competitiveness, and I would say that we have now cases, very interesting cases to think about in the interactions between innovation and competition policy. And there are, as you mentioned, there are two aspects. The first one is something like innovation as a sword, where you're going to challenge a merger because there is a risk for innovation. And we have cases where this innovation theory of harm is clearly at stake, where, for instance, in the Bayer-Monsanto case, or Illumina Grail, or even Adobe and Figma. But today, I would say the second aspect of the debate is innovation as a shield. I mean, situations where undertakings are able to show that their merger is favorable to innovation. And I would say that in the Draghi report, there are not a lot of things about competition law in the Draghi report, I have to say. But on innovation, there is a proposal that is clearly interesting, and I have more questions than answers on that. Let me quote the Draghi report. What evidence merging parties can present to prove that their merger increases ability and the incentive to innovate? So far, and Ingrid, maybe you could confirm that, but in practice, I have the impression that the European Commission is reluctant with efficiencies that are not merger-specific, verifiable, and passed on to consumers. And I guess that a lot of answers to the public consultations circle around these three conditions, and to what extent the European Commission would be able to open the door to other scenarios. And so my last comment again would be a question. We have seen something like an evolution in the Nokia Infinera case in January 25, where clearly innovation led the European Commission to be more favorable to the merger. And I would like to ask to the enforcers if this is an isolated decision or if they're behind a movement towards more favorable approach to mergers where innovation is at stake.
Daniele, I think that's a question for you, but you don't have to if you don't want to answer.
No, I think it's definitely, you know, it's one of the key. I agree that it's one of the key topics that stem from the Draghi report. It's something that it's not novel to think of innovation in competition enforcement. We started the discussion. Obviously, we started from the negative effects on innovation. We had a stream of cases which where we developed a framework to understand how competition can have or mergers rather can have an impact on innovation, and to set some benchmarks and parameters and the four-layered test, etc. in the agrochemical cases. So it was. This was a number of cases that followed on earlier cases where we had already started to look at pipeline to pipeline competition, pipeline to market, etc. So I think that the reflection on innovation has been there for a decade now at the European Commission. It is time to reflect that in the guidelines. There is clearly more appetite for dynamic criteria, because I think that we see a lot of industries that move very fast and where you have to, you know, take this into account when you look forward, which means in the negative and in the positive at the same time. You may argue that on the positive side, there's not as many things as on the negative side yet, but that's clearly something on which we are working. And in that respect, to go back to also something that Ingrid was saying before about startups, I think that Vice President Ribera already announced one of the novelties that there will be in the guidance that we intend to provide, which is this innovation shield, which is essentially, you know, setting out positively the parameters under which we would not consider that a deal involving a startup or an innovative company would give rise to negative concerns, when it comes to innovation competition. And it's because of a take-home from the public consultation, which is essentially that if you look at the recent debate, we always were focused on trying to. There was also a jurisdictional debate in the past years where we were saying, oh, maybe we should capture certain deals where there can be a killer effect on innovation. And we were really focusing on defining these parameters. What people are telling us is that, you know, there's not many of these deals, especially if you consider them against the pool of transactions that happen that concern innovative companies. So, and I think the proof is in the pudding, because now you all know that there's a new notification tool under the DMA where we get informed of a lot of deals that happen, and you don't see us going out with a gun to shoot everything that moves, right? So there is an understanding that not every deal is negative in that respect. However, the market is telling us that there's a bit of uncertainty on how we think about these issues. So the fact that we're providing guidance on dynamic criteria would be an opportunity, as Vice President Ribera said, to set out a sort of safe harbor, a shield, which is basically going to define ex ante, you know, the type of deals that we will not be considering as potential candidates for innovation concerns, where you can, you know, then also infer that we consider them rather positive for innovation.
Maybe I have a follow-on question or follow-up question. Sorry. You mentioned killer acquisitions, tech mergers, the DMA. To me, that raises the recent paper by Florian Ederer and his co-authors on tech mergers and their potential effect on innovation. I don't know, like, people may have thoughts on what Daniel just said, but if you also have thoughts on that paper and sort of implications or not for merger control, that would be super interesting.
I cannot comment on the paper specifically, but I think, you know, we are looking into the literature. You may also know, I think I will repeat it, maybe, that we're doing a study that is also looking into the academic literature on the impact on mergers on innovation, on the relationship between concentration and innovation. And I think,
very topical, very relevant today.
Not just that paper, but a lot of, there's a lot of literature. I mean, there are hundreds of publications in this space right now, and we are considering all of them. So I don't think it's appropriate to just single one out and to think what I infer from that. But I mean, we're looking very carefully at the debate that the academic community is having, particularly because if you intend to provide guidance on this, you need to do your homework well and to understand also from the economic perspective what makes sense. Because, as I said, the intention is not just to say, oh, innovation is important, here's our guidelines now, try to interpret it. It's really to provide certain concrete benchmarks and concrete parameters that also companies can apply when they self-assess, help by their lawyers, a prospective merger.
That's right.
I think it's encouraging to hear that. It goes back to Ingrid's point about presumptions. I think that there is often a sense that the literature or sort of the zeitgeist suggests certain characteristics, certain market structures are more conducive to innovation than others, or resiliency, or whatever it is. I think the literature is very clear that those presumptions are are generally incorrect, or certainly can't be generalized. And in particular, I think it's worth pointing out that one of the reasons I think it's encouraging to hear the way you said that is that we have had recently in the U.S. at least merger enforcers making very explicit a claim that's not really in the statutes that says that we should favor, what do they call it, organic growth, internal growth over growth through acquisition. And it's a sort of it's not a false dichotomy, but both of those are forms of investment, often investment that's aimed at innovation, and you simply can't say presumptively that one is better than the other. But there is, I think, a sense, I think this is what you were suggesting, Ingrid, that sort of all of these ancillary considerations are sort of push in one direction. They sort of suggest that there are problems with mergers, that mergers are harmful to innovation, that they're harmful to resiliency, that they are, I think that there's no basis for concluding that, and hearing you say what you said is really useful in that regard. But I do think that that's not enough, in that where people actually care, of course, and where the rubber hits the road is in those sort of marginal, difficult cases. It's helpful to know that the Commission is, for example, considering dynamic efficiency effects and innovation as a reason not to challenge a merger. That's great, but then the problem is the marginal case. I mean, the problem is the Illumina Grail, really, is the paradigmatic problematic case. And I just don't know if it's going to be hard. I mean, very difficult to prescribe guidelines that would explain the right approach for Illumina Grail. But that's where it's needed. And of course, and if you can't, you just say, well, we won't intervene. That should be your.
But I think it's a very, very interesting question. I mean, if you look at the years when we thought we could do Illumina, as we heard the record before, I think you had at the Commission you had 3 cases in 3 years, I think, of that kind. And since the Illumina years are over, and now we're in the brave new world of call-ins by national competition authority, I think we just have 1 on the books. I don't think that I don't think that shows that we are overly excited about taking any deal that happens in that space, which conversely, you can interpret of the fact, and the deals that we screen are many more. I can tell you, in the Illumina times, I think we had dozens of deals that we were screening, many on a monthly basis. Sometimes we send requests for information, and eventually we didn't intervene. So it shows you that there was this idea that, you know, there's a very vast number of cases that happen in the innovation space or, you know, with startups, etc., which are really non-problematic, and, you know, and our wallet was where our mouth is right now. Point taken that these parameters are not very clear, you know, that some people have no clarity, and I think that's what I was saying before, to provide this innovation shield to make the parameters clear so that people can know what to expect. The question of marginal cases, however, I think is a pertinent one, but my answer, I think, I don't want to be cheeky, but, you know, there will always be a marginal case. If you have a system that is 100% predictable, then you have basically zero interventions, you know, because, you know, everybody knows what is to notify and what is not to notify, right? And on Illumina, you know, I mean, you shouldn't talk of past lovers, but overall, you know, the European perspective is, you know, you came out of Madhu and you went after this case, and who could have expected this? I mean, okay, let's look on the other side of the Atlantic, you know, where the deal was notified and they litigated it, they had issues about it. I mean, so I don't, is that the case that, you know, when you reflect on it ex ante, you think, well, this is going to be totally unproblematic, the commission went crazy and it drank its Kool-Aid to go after this case? I'm not sure that that's what happened, right? So, I mean, to think that the Illumina was this monstrous idea on substance, not on the jurisdiction side, this monstrous idea of a case that where nobody would have expected that you intervene, I'm like, okay, well, what about the FTC then?
Unless you think they went crazy too, which is quite possible.
Or the appeals court, the federal appeals court in Texas. That's a bit too many crazy people.
Maybe just to raise one other element is as you're, and it's also, I agree, very helpful to hear that these studies are taking place and looking into how we look at innovation. Some of the things that I have seen and was surprised about, and have seen also in cases, like for this issue around R&D is always good. We want always more R&D. So if there is any, killer acquisition is this concept that was created by the European Commission, was brought in there, it says whatever you do, you cannot kill any R&D, and so we need to protect all R&D. And it caused a very sort of significant impact on merger review, right? There are many studies that show that R&D can be very duplicative, right? That it's not part of efficiencies to allow for duplicative R&D. So just to say, okay, both parties are doing R&D, so therefore it all needs to coexist and you cannot combine these, in of itself, that is what I would also call a presumptive approach, right? There's no evidence to show that duplicative R&D is helpful, that it would necessarily be competing and come to a better outcome. Some of the studies in the pharmaceutical space, I've been told, I've heard these, we had it at one of our events, one of the PhD was explained to me that what they've actually seen is when you have research in one area and a company acquires a company with another research in the same area, they will actually end up doing more of research in the same area because guess what? You have tangential related outcomes that will inform new research that if you keep those entirely separate will not be there to cross-fertilize one another. And so the concern that I think exists is there's this very, whether it's superficial, whether it's presumptive view on certain aspects of innovation that now permeate some of the decisions that would benefit from a broader look. And then I think the second element I would say is it would be very important to, going forward, have a full explanation of efficiencies in decisions so that the precedent and the ability to see these decisions written out is very important. Not all jurisdictions have it. The Commission does this. It's very, very helpful. If there is an assessment, not only in guidelines, but also in decisions of this is how we assess the innovative impact, and this is what we require, and this is what we've analyzed, that would be very helpful to create also precedent that is more robust, in addition to guidelines of what those efficiencies would entail.
David?
Yeah, just two comments. The first one is I really would like to have an answer on having a more relaxed application of these criteria and merger-specific efficiencies is key in my opinion. And the second comment is, I think you work in silos at the European Commission. Why? Because you have today two guidelines that you are reviewing. The first one's on Article 102, and the second one's on mergers. And I think that it would be wise to explain to the people how we are going to live in a post-Towercast world. Because one could imagine that ex ante, ex post enforcement could be rethink in innovative markets. So it could be a great opportunity to say, this type of mergers are not going to be reviewed under merger control, but we have Article 102, for instance. And I think it's a very good opportunity to rethink the ex post, ex ante dilemma or distinction.
I say, no, on to Ingrid, and then maybe let's open the floor for everybody. But to Ingrid's point, I think that there's no assumption that the merger is negative for R&D just by a linear impact on, or that there's a linear relationship between the slashing some R&D budget and finding an issue on innovation. I think in the one case where we went adept on this issue, it was rather the opposite. There was an assessment of the intensity going down. So it's not just you slash, it's 1+, but it's really going down in intensity, going down in expected output. And I think that the analysis was corroborated by a huge study of actual plans, actual performance of the companies and of the industry, which many of which are now redacted because there's a lot of internal document analysis, but it was a long and deep analysis to get to that conclusion. And I think, that if you consider that there's a lot of deals that result in synergies also in the R&D department, I mean, we haven't intervened in all those cases for sure. To the point that we need to be more explicit about what parameters we take into account, you can expect that the more innovation is an important parameter of competition that is brought up in deals, and we have to take a position on that. Obviously, our case practice will evolve. I would say that if we have guidelines on the table before, it would it's also be helpful because we first say how we're going to do it, and then we start applying it. And it's not going to be easy. It's difficult when you actually sit down and think of how to give easy parameters to apply. But we're trying to do that. To your question, I think going back to, we're not going to alter the objectives of competition. That's the easy answer. We're going to take certain qualitative parameters of competition into account where we try to assess efficiencies. I think, yes, we're going to have to dictate, the conditions on which we're going to take them into account and how you can prove them, because, it's not, that you just allege them or you just show a document that say this is what we want to do, because, that's not going to be enough. But there's a reflection ongoing of what is the standard that you need to prove it. But I think that, and in terms of working in silos, I think, I don't think that we will be able to reconcile the quantum physics of merger with the gravitational theory of 102 into a single framework that will be beautiful for everything. Because eventually, I mean, again, going back to what I was saying before, I think, in 102, you go there, you need the surgery for something that is already in your body, and, essentially they need to do certain things. Whereas we are the ones, we want to give you the benchmark of your blood samples that you go to the doctor, exam, and says, well, based on these parameters, it looks all right. So that's what we're trying to do. And it's a different job.
There is one aspect of this, though, that shouldn't be hard to capture at all. Just that, and Illumina Grail is a great example. I mean, where you have especially vertical mergers, and the theory of harm is that might lead to the prevention of a merger is sort of defined ex ante. Well, ex post review becomes very simple. All you have to do is watch for whether that conduct occurs, and then apply 102 to it. And so, in a sense, there is a natural relationship between the two, and especially in vertical mergers where you have a very well-defined theory of harm, you ought to be, it almost is a reason simply to forbear from merger enforcement at all and just say, listen, 102 guys, your job is easy. We've told you what to look for.
Yeah. That's for vertical case. I think, as a matter of law, the legislators decided that sometimes preemptive care is much more efficient for a society than, ex post work. And, that's true for health, but it's also true for market power, right? So it's not me who chooses. I mean, it's the legislator that said, I don't have a problem with your dominant position. I don't have a problem if you abuse it. But, if en route to your dominant position, you acquire a company and become dominant, then I have the problem with that. So that's I'm not going to change that.
No. And I think
it's the legislator that made, and I think also that it has a societal benefit, right? And
okay. Yeah, sorry. No, we could keep going on, but I I made 2 promises before this panel. The first was to Emily, our events manager, that we'd finish on time. And the second was to Daniele, that we wouldn't turn this panel into just everyone grilling the commission. Yeah. So I need to live up to those 2. And in that spirit, what I do have are some surprise questions and then hopefully some audience questions, because we have 10 minutes left. So number 1, surprise question. And I would like everyone to answer in either 1 word or maximum a sentence. It's like rapid fire. All right. So in the Draghi report, Mario Draghi says the European economy has fallen behind the American economy, among others. It needs to be put on some cure. It needs pills to make it better. Among those pills is competition policy. Now, let's say that we speak 15 years in the future and the European economy has caught up to the American economy. What percentage of that could European competition law contribute to? And if you give a number, that's the best answer. Like, what's everyone's number on that?
10%.
That was going to be my number too.
It depends on how you look at it, right? If you say it's a but, I mean, I'm a lawyer. It's a but.
This is a lot of clauses. Yeah.
It depends how you formulate that, because if you put it in the bucket of bringing in an out of market efficiency, I agree 10%. If you look at it, well, we're going to be different on our presumption of harm, evidentiary standards, I would say 30-40%.
Okay. Daniele?
No, I amend mine.
I would with the analyst consensus. I would say on this one. I think obviously competition law has an important role to play in society. But if you do a quantitative analysis, you can ask ChatGPT how much of the Draghi report is about competition. Apply that percentage to our contribution.
We will have a prediction market on Polymarket to figure it out. Second question.
Can you ask what's more important than competition?
Maybe someone for the audience. But I have a second question, which you will enjoy, Jeff. In this world where we put the European Union and European competition law on steroids, what is the future role of economics, so econometrics, price theory, and industrial organization? And I'll ask you to answer with one of 3 words. Either it's buy, you think that these things are going to be more important in future competition policy, sell, you think they will be less important in future competition policy, for example, because we're now thinking about things like geopolitics, or hold, which is they will sort of have the same role in the future as they do today. So what is it?
You're asking me if I'm buying economic consultant stock tomorrow, and I would go hold.
I mean, I would say should be buy, but probably hold.
I would agree. I would hope buy, really hope buy, but maybe hold. Yeah.
Yeah, same.
All right. And with that, we still have 5 minutes for audience questions. Thibaut? Sorry.
I'll take this one. All right. So you've all said very important things, but there is one thing that I think was very, very important. It's what you started with, David. You do not change the law with guidelines. You need to go to the European Parliament, right? Now, a lot of the discussion, and I see that you wanted for the second panel to already be covered and for us to have nothing to say. So you talked a lot about innovation. There is one word, though, here, the one of resilience, that I think is extremely important. And if we were to go to the Parliament to make it indeed part of merger control, I do think that there is a way to operationalize that word. And in complexity economics, and yes, I had to talk about it, there are papers as to how we can model the resilience or the centrality of a company for the whole economy. I'll just give you one by Stefan Thurner. And we are trying to co-author a piece to see what it means specifically for merger control. But what they showed in that paper is that in Hungary, where they had access to the data, if 0.030% of companies were to collapse, then 24% of the whole economy will collapse. Now, I think this is the kind of analysis that you do want to take into consideration when it comes to merger control. Now, what you make out of it is not exactly clear. You could say well, therefore, yes to a merger to make it more robust, more resilient, or no to a merger because it will actually weaken the resilience of the economy. But I do see that resilience could be operationalized and be more than just one of those concepts where, you know, that becomes convenient for putting in a story. So I wonder if there are any reactions to these comments. Not necessarily.
I mean, I would agree because I think we're creating false contrasts, I think, with some of the goals that competition law has and some of the other policies on many fronts. I don't think their contrasts are quite so significant.
No, it's true, and really the fundamental problem, I think, is this question of out-of-market effects and temporal, the temporal and geographic, for lack of a better word, or, you know, topographic issues. Do you take account of the expected or possible effects on you know, markets, 6 markets removed from the one you're looking at, and, you know, 10 years into the future when you're undertaking your merger review? I mean, I think if you have the ability, if it's not administratively excessively expensive, you should. But I don't think. But, you know, right now our response is, it's too administratively expensive. We're going to look at this in this market, only this market, and, you know, relatively short-term effects.
Yep.
I don't think we have to be stuck with that.
All right. I think we have 2 minutes left, which is enough for one audience question. Who will be the lucky person? And it should ideally be a question that lends itself to a short answer. Otherwise, we'll go over time.
Alexis Walkers, I'm an economist. I will make my question very short. Do you think you need a merger for efficiencies that would arise in the next 2 years, or would some other kind of arrangement be sufficient?
Sometimes, yeah. Is that? I mean, yes. Sometimes.
The question is more: is it not the purpose of a merger to think about the long run, and that basically, you know, if you don't look at the long run, usually mergers make no sense because it takes you 2 years to get into you know, whatever you know, change you want to put in place in a company.
Yeah.
Yeah. Agreed.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And this is going to be a pretty challenging session because I don't know why the organizer decided to pick up such a boring and outdated topics on AI, ecosystem innovation. I haven't heard about this topic in the antitrust circles in the very few years, but that's, I guess, the reason why they pick up such a great lineup of speakers to make interesting something that otherwise would be boring. And yes, so I'm supposed to moderate this panel, and the format is pretty similar to the previous one. We are going to address each of these topics. I would ask one of the speaker per time to kick off and set the scene. And I wouldn't spend so much time in describing the topic. I mean, everyone knows that these are probably the most urgent and timing issue that we are going to address. And I would also have skipped the introduction of the speaker, but, you know, Emily Ullman, which is the Iron Lady in charge of the organization of this event, say, please, Giuseppe, play by the book. So that means wear a suit and introduce the speaker. Her expectations of me are extremely low. So I'm going to introduce our speaker, despite the fact, as David Deltermer tells, they do not need any introduction. On my right side, there is Eliana Garcés, co-founder and principal at LAP Economics. Then we have a good friend, a runner, and a former tennis player, that is Thibaut Schreppel, associate professor of law at the University in Amsterdam. Then we have Alexander Destrel, that is not a runner, not a tennis player, at least no more, but I wish. but is academic director at CERN and Professor Yulu at Namur University. At the very end of this table, we have Anders Riedel, managing partner at Van Bell and Bellis. So, as I mentioned, we have 3 buckets. So I would start from the first one that is related to the role of innovation in mergers. And I would ask Alexander the role of setting the scene.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation. So, I mean, in a way, I mean, this was part of the previous panel quite a bit. So I hope we will not be too repetitive. But I would like to start with an affidavit of Kenneth Arrow. You know, there is a Nobel Prize yesterday or 2 days ago. So I think it's always go back to Nobel Prize in the U.S. Microsoft case. And I didn't remember that he did that, so I will read it, because Jeff, you are saying, okay, if you don't know, it's better not to do anything, but I think often we don't know, so then I guess the public power should not do much. But he said so he was intervening for the government, for the Department of Justice in the context of the U.S. Microsoft case, and he says the transient of and he was talking about the PC application software is not a justification for complacency. On the contrary, it requires an effort to maintain the openness of the market so that new technology can have an opportunity to enter and show their value relative to older one. And basically, what was the new technology? Google. Okay, so of course, so I just want to open that by saying it's not because you have innovation and it's not because you have disruptive innovation that nothing needs to be done. Because in fact, you need to remain. You need to have those markets open for the disruptor to enter in the market. Okay, because it is not. I mean, disruptor at some point need to connect with the customer, and often for that they need to use the access to the main platform of the day. You know, and I always like to think about Donald Trump, you know, because he was clearly a disruptor in his own way in U.S. politics, and I am not sure that without the access to the Republican Party, he would have been able to be a U.S. president. You know, so that is showing you that a disruptor need a way to access. In this case, the voter, or in other case, the customer. So basically, I think that having innovation, and even disruptive innovation, which is in a way the most radical form of innovation, do not mean that you have to do less. You know, it means that you have to do differently, probably, and that's what we discussed before. But I wouldn't say that you have to do less. Doing differently mean first having new metrics. And I think that more than before, we have to enter into the black box of the firm, you know, and that's a bit what the Commission has tried to do in your. You were mentioning the Don Dupont case, but there has been other case where you know, to enter and to understand what are the innovation capabilities. I think that is a learning that we get from strategic management, and that really needs to be imported into antitrust. The second thing, it was also discussed before, is to adapt the standard of proof. You know, so clearly, when you are doing a dynamic analysis, there is more uncertainty. We discussed that before, and I think the main let's say objective, I would say, of the guidelines is try to reduce as much as possible the trade-off between a dynamic analysis and predictability. So that's really, I think, the trick of the guidelines. But I would say that one way to do that is to try to adapt the standard of proof. And I give you one example, and that is in the context of the telecom merger. We mentioned that before. What the CMA has done in the context of the 4-3 UK merger in the Vodafone case. What the CMA says is you can merge provided that there is this investment remedy. And in a way, that idea has been taken over also in the Draghi report. But I would say that this investment remedy has not necessarily anything to do with incentive to invest or not, because I know that the people of DG sometimes told me, I mean, why they do that, why they have that a remedy. Either they have an incentive to invest and they will invest, or they don't, and then you don't have to impose that remedy because they will not do it anyway. But I see this investment remedy not so much as a substantive issue, but more as a standard of proof issue, because it's a way, in a way, to reassure the enforcer that this efficiency that is, let's say, put forward by the company will indeed be realized. So I think that's how we can we can see that. And the third is some adaptation of the burden of proof. And I think that this idea of the harm should be proved by the authority, and then the efficiency should be proved by the parties. Maybe we have to have everyone has to play its own role for both, you know, or maybe we have to even collapse the two-step into one. And just to finish, I mean, I've just finished a paper with Pierre Larouche on disruptive innovation and antitrust, and the part on merger, how we try to do a kind of to come with a number of tests for a merger analysis in the context of a disruption or in the context of a killer acquisition. And we think that the first things to look at is whether there is a reduction of innovation. Okay, so because too often I think we mix the discussion of innovation and competition, and I think those are two different things. They are linked obviously, but those are two different things. So the first is you look whether there is a reduction of innovation, and for that you have two steps. So first you have to look whether the company which is acquired, so the potential disruptor, has already the innovation capability to be a disruptor. Okay, so basically you look at whether there is an ability for the company to disrupt. And if you take the famous example of Facebook WhatsApp, there the question would be whether WhatsApp had back then the innovation capabilities to become a disruptor in social network. Then the second question is you have to look whether the acquirer will kill the innovation, so stop the innovation, or take it for its own ecosystem. You know, and in this case, the question was whether Facebook will keep WhatsApp and bring the innovation of WhatsApp in its own ecosystem, or kill the innovation. We know that it maintained it, so it's clearly not a killer. In this case, it's clearly not a killer acquisition. So I would say that for that first part, reduction of innovation, we cannot say that there was a problem of innovation in the Facebook WhatsApp case. But then I think you have to go to the second question, which is if there is no reduction of innovation, so if there is a reduction of innovation, I think you should stop the merger. If there is no reduction of innovation, then you have to look at whether there is a reduction of competition. And if you think about the Facebook WhatsApp case, I think the alternative was not whether WhatsApp was bought by Facebook or would be standalone. I mean, there was a third alternative, which I think would have been the best, is WhatsApp being bought by Google, for instance, you know, because Google was a less close competitor than Facebook. So basically, I think what we should do in those cases is first to distinguish between the effect on innovation and look at the ability and incentive, and then to look at competition and the closeness of potential competition. So that is giving one example where I think you can have some robust tests and predictable tests to address those issues of innovation.
Thank you, Alexander, for setting the scene. I would ask a quick reaction from our panelists. I will start with Thibaut.
Sure. And I want to say I very much agree with the conclusion, which is that it is possible to make it robust. Now, the interesting question to me is whether we have something already in the case law that is robust, and if so, how can it be merged with what we do academics, or if we have nothing, how can we build it from the ground? And so in that context, and I won't take long, but what I've done in a paper published last year, so it's not up to date anymore, but I've done some empirical work on not the European Commission, but what's happening before the General Court and the Court of Justice of the EU. And in that paper, what I tried to map is whether the concept of innovation appears and has some importance in our competition analysis. So it could be when you define the market, it could be when you try to analyze the practice, whether it's harm to innovation, or on the contrary, try to justify the practice, or when you design the remedies. And what I found is that, which was first a surprise to me, there are, or at least at the time, only 20 cases in the history of EU competition law before the courts in which innovation was given some weight, right? So I'm not talking about doing a quick search and trying to see if the word innovation appears, but really try to see, is innovation playing a substantial role in the analysis? And the main finding is that EU courts, they lack a coherent analysis and a complete theory of innovation. Now, to be fair to the court, as you know, there is the principle of party disposition, which means that the court can only react to what the parties will actually bring to the court, right? So it's also an issue for practitioners and potentially all of us. Now, to be more specific, there are three key findings. The first one is that the court has a inconsistent use of some parameters related to innovation. So to be specific, there are only 3 cases in which the long-term effects are being considered. And in some cases, you see that they deal with the same kind of companies or the same kind of practice or the same industry. And sometimes long-term effects are considered, some other times they are not. When it comes to the inconsistency still, and this one, and we discussed that in the first panel, is potentially even more concerning. You see that competitors' innovation capacity is only considered in 7 of those cases. So often the analysis is about the merging parties or the company that abused dominant position, but what competitors are doing and their capacity is often left out of the picture. And last, when it comes to those inconsistencies, what you see is that there are no patterns that I could distinguish as to whether the court is using an incentive effect, which is when competition drives innovation, or the impact effect, and those are terms used in the economic literature, which is innovation drives competition. So sometimes for the same industries, you see one or the other dynamic being mentioned. The second pattern in those cases is that there are some missing elements. So in a sense, you could say, well, at least you have consistency because consistently we do not study those elements. But I see that as a concern. You've mentioned disruptive innovation. Well, not only the terms, but also the concept or the idea of it appears is in 0 of those ECG cases, right? It's not something that we consider, at least in what we've seen before the court. There is only one case in which process innovation was considered, which is innovation in how you produce stuff, you know, dynamic capabilities, how you design the company. Again, to enter the firm black box, it seems that it's not something that we do. Often when we talk about innovation, we talk about products. But those process innovation could play a very important role, and yet only one case. Innovation is never considered outside of the relevant market. And there is no analysis of innovation outside the market boundaries such as defined in the case. Again, 0. And the very last point, and I'll finish there, is that in some cases you see that there is unequal weight being given to innovation. To some degree, this is problematic, but not necessarily. I'll give you one example. The concept of market power was deemed, if you had supermarket shares, to be necessary and sufficient to show dominance back in the days. And then the more it goes, and it makes sense, with the digital economy, the more you see that there is a tendency to say, well, having market shares, it could be a clue, but it's not enough to show there is dominance. Now, the way the courts have transitions from one concept to the other, I think is problematic and could be more robust. Now, to finish on a positive note, there are things that the courts of justice and the general courts do well. The first one is that when they identify a market in which innovation is a survival strategy, meaning you have no choice but to innovate because it is a very digital, very dynamic market, systematically the courts then explore whether there are barriers for those companies to innovate, which makes sense, because if they do not, the presumption will be that, well, they are not because there are barriers and not because they have decided that they want to die as a company. The second things that they do well is that when innovation is a growth strategy, so it's a nice feature but not a necessity, then the court systematically then explores the incentive to innovate, which is, again, I think exactly what is the question you should ask. And the very last is that, and it comes back again to what you mentioned, Alex, for the standard of proof, the court, and I think this is right, they have so far played by the likely effects of a practice and or the likely effect of using innovation as a way to justify a practice, which I think is right. We can talk about the proxies to measure innovation, but in economic literature, there is not a perfect paper or model that would tell you, well, this is exactly the perfect measure to show how innovative is a company. So in absence of that, I think we do have to use proxies, and this is what the Court of Justice has recognized.
Thank you, Thibaut. Eliana, do you want to jump in?
Yes. Is this working? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, no, I'm going to add something and expand on that. So we talk a lot about innovation as a feature of a particular firm. The firm is innovative, they're investing, they're innovating. I think what we're facing now, and we have a problem we're struggling to tackle with, is the fact that the digital technology brings a different type of innovations, which is a combinatorial innovation. So because you can integrate things, you can combine, you can repurpose, and also it makes the technology more complex, and you need more complementers. You can rarely do things yourself, and so we're in a space where you see agglutination of different companies trying to jointly produce or develop services or systems of services, and then we'll come to ecosystems before. And so I want to challenge a little bit this idea of an innovation like a commodity, almost like something you purchase, you acquire, and it lives independently in a company, which exists. We know that's I would say like the pharma model in a way. But it's not the most complex issue that we're facing here, and so I take a little bit of I challenge a little bit this idea of a platform as something you have to access to get to customers, and I've always thought the word gatekeeper of the DMA is extremely unfortunate because it's extremely reductionist, and I would say that platforms you have to think about platforms and ecosystems as organizations that bring different type of players together, and the platform plays a role of coordination within that organization with more or less power, more or less decisions that are centralized, but it is an organization. It is not a gatekeeper in the sense that it is actively investing and developing the value that platform jointly produces. And I think it's a shift that merits to be done so that we can actually tackle what is actually happening on a platform. And it's, I think, not very encouraging when you see the merger consultation and the questions that were asked. You can already see the way that the Commission has been treating digital services, and the DMA is an example of that. But you can see it in the merger that features like economies of scope are treated like a problem. So if you're acquiring, think of Google Fitbit. I'm acquiring a complementary service that will join my ecosystem. I will have access to data that I could repurpose for many other things, including advertisement, what Google was found to be dominant. And so the remedy is you cannot use the data for advertisement because it will give you an unfair advantage over other potential advertising services. So the approach is always an economy of scope, and efficiency is a problem because it provides an unmerited advantage, let's call it that way. Booking, eTravelI, you will share, you buy a product that shares a customer base, and therefore, even though you do nothing, and that's the interesting part of the ecosystem theory of harm developed in that case, that there's no conduct involved necessarily. It's just that by acquiring that service and somehow having an element of integration, let's say an API, or customers may decide to consume your other complementary services, and that is also considered a problem. And what is lost here is the rationale for an ecosystem. Like, why are ecosystems happening? What are ecosystems? Because they're creating something new. What problems are they solving that gives rise to new sets of services, new forms of organization, new ways of consuming and of consuming products and services? We'll talk about ecosystems later, and I can expand on that there. But I think there's a lot of the good things that digital technologies are bringing, and a lot of the efficiency that gets lost and probably gets destroyed in some moments. And I'm not saying ecosystems should be validated and exonerated from competition policy enforcement. That's not at all. But we need to understand much better and formalize what is it that they do, so we can assess them a lot better. And there, I don't see a lot of encouraging signs in the merger review, in the merger guidelines review, in that directions. Which means there's still a lot of work that hopefully there'll be space to make that work and formalize those ecosystem dynamics a little bit better.
Andreas, looking forward for your innovative contribution to this.
Sure, I will be very short, just to highlight some of the issues that he said. So, Thibault, I rightly pointed out that there isn't too much in the case law that would really sort of set principles. And you alluded to this in defense of the court, and that's something I rarely say. I defend the courts. The reason is that these issues, as you also illustrated so well, are still very in development, and unless this particular question is outcome determinative for, in our case, a merger in the sense of a prohibition decision squarely centered on innovation theories of harm, it's just not going to be before the court, because that's not what parties litigate about. So unfortunately, I think the courts probably will be the last ones to resolve or contribute to the puzzle rather than taking the lead. One thing I found interesting, and I think highlights just the complexity of this, when Alex described sort of his general model or thinking. So on the one hand, you said we need to protect the disruptor. And then when you talked about the merger scenario with an add-on acquisition, so Facebook, WhatsApp is an example, right? You I think correctly pointed out that the relevant question is, does the merger, the acquisition of an add-on service actually enhance innovative capabilities, which we often actually observe in the industry? But then, of course, you can run into the problem, and there may be a trade-off to say, well, it's good for consumers that Facebook acquires WhatsApp because it has much more innovative potential within the big house with the spillover innovation that Elena also mentioned. But then you can have, of course, the next argument saying, yeah, and this gets into the ecosystem, right? Then you say, well, but if Facebook now has this extra service and actually improves it, maybe it becomes more difficult for the next innovative rival to get in, because now the ecosystem is even more attractive. And so that it's just another illustration that depending very much on the circumstances, whether you're worried about the platform excluding rivals or here more the ecosystem effects on innovation, you may have a situation where you have actually a lot more potential effects on innovation than just looking at one of the particular issues.
Yeah, can I say one thing? Two things. Yes, I agree, and so I think that I'm not all for an innovation offense. Okay, so if indeed the goal of the merger is to increase and improve the ecosystem, I think it should be a good thing. But my point here was there was another ecosystem which was a lesser, closer competitor, which could have buy, and in fact they were in negotiation with WhatsApp to buy WhatsApp. And I think that would have been a better thing, because then you would have increased more the competition within ecosystem, across ecosystem. And to take also, and that's the second point, to take the point of Eliana, so I'm not for prohibiting a merger in case for an innovation offense, but then, you know, if you end up with one ecosystem because it has become the best, and we are in a kind of matrix scenario, you know, then I think you have to regulate that ecosystem. That's the only thing I see. And so to come back to the discussion we had before on the relationship between ex ante and ex post, or regulation and competition, I think then you need a regulation. But then to come back to what Eliana was saying, and maybe we will discuss that later, you have, of course, to understand very well the governance mechanism of the ecosystem to decide where you open the ecosystem if the ecosystem is alone.
I have a question for you, and I was just given the right to ask you the question. What's the limit for you? What's the limit to your reasoning? Because you say it would have been better for Google to acquire it. Would you say it would have been even better for a company doing agriculture stuff to acquire it? because at some point you lose the capacities to actually develop the technology, right? So where do you put the needle?
I mean, I think in this case, Google was in negotiation. So, I mean, it is not that I'm inventing something out of the blue. And Google has the same, I think, innovation capabilities than Facebook. It's just that they were not as close competitor.
Yeah. But in social, so the standard will be you have to be in negotiation and to show an interest.
No. Yeah, and not a close competitor.
I'm with Thibaut here. I actually don't think the odds of Google succeeding with the app may have been as high as with Facebook, now Meta. Google has, I don't know if they're here, but they've systematically failed at all things social.
They are everywhere.
They're here. They're except on social. They have invested. So they have invested. Everybody remembers or not Google Plus. So the fact that you decide. So I think I agree that there is an issue of capabilities, and it comes down to ecosystems being about a value proposition and a project, and sometimes taking avenues that fail. And you test, and it's a very experimental field. You experiment and fail. There is always a value proposition in an ecosystem. There is always something that makes it strong, and not everything works. And so, well, I mean, so I leave it at that. But I subscribe with. So you can
I know we need to conclude this point.
Andreas, you may go on because Emily left the room. So
Okay.
we have 30 seconds of anarchy yet.
Just because I was also asked on the panel to provide
Just
a practical viewpoint on this. So I think what we discuss here would be the most dangerous path that merger analysis can take, especially from an advisory deal planning perspective. So imagine you already go through all the complications to help parties assess whether the merger is doable or not. You come up with all the arguments, and then you conclude, actually, I cannot tell you anything because the regulator might go around in the market and just see whether there's something they like better than you as a buyer. I think including this in the merger analysis is in terms of deal planning, actually making deals happen, an extraordinary dangerous. We have it in certain areas, like with failing firms, but go out generally and say, well, this company actually is a little better than this. So if you want to acquire it, I think it sort of on and off works or not. Take the other. That doesn't work at all. Okay. That's my caution here, to get too far into the thicket here and see what's the market like and what's the least concerning transaction. That's the only one we'll allow.
But can I say one thing? Because many people say they want a more dynamic analysis, and then when there is unpredictability, they complain about the unpredictability. And so if you put the two together, I think the main message is the Commission can close the shop. And I think that's cannot be right. So, and I'm not speaking about you, but I think I have been to so many debates where I heard those two things. I want more dynamic analysis, but but if it is unpredictable, it doesn't work either. And I think, inevitably, if you are a more dynamic analysis, you will be a bit more unpredictable. The question, of course, is how much unpredictability, and it should be acceptable. And here, if I take again that example, you have a clear criteria. I mean, Facebook was, to me, a too close potential competitor to WhatsApp to buy it. So, I mean, the answer of the Commission could have been no, and then I'm sure that WhatsApp would have found someone else. That's the point. So it's not that it's up to the Commission
Andreas,
to say...
please do not react.
No.
Do not react.
No, but I mean, because I think I think we need to also understand that there is dilemma, but if the consequence of the dilemma is to do nothing, I think then we kill competition law.
Okay. Let's move to the second topic that has been already addressed, at least partially. So I will ask you to keep shorter your reaction because I still want to discuss also about AI. So let's discuss about, in terms of the methodological challenges that Alexander introduced about innovation, we may have the very same challenge when it comes to ecosystems. How assess ecosystem, their effects, the need for novelty requirements, so on and so forth. I would ask Eliana to set the scene, and again, let's have a quick reaction on this topic so we have time to discuss also about AI partnership and so on and so forth.
So, I already introduced the topic. So I think it's useful to see ecosystems not as a gatekeeper in the middle dominating or trying to expand and leverage additional services, which may happen. I'm not saying that there aren't instances where you would preemptively acquire a competitor. That's all the theories of harm can apply. But I think by default, it's a problem to consider them by default. I think ecosystems in the digital space particularly are organizations that have the capacity to use that technology to solve problems that were not easily solved before. I'll name the main ones, or let's say we can put them all in three buckets: information failures. Everybody knows it's easier to find the right customers if you have online connections and data and network effects. So meaning a lot of people go to the same place, you have information about them, it is easy to find a counterparty. Personalization is a resolution also of an information failure. If you think you can become more efficient, I'm talking about obviously positive and desirable personalization. I'm not talking about stalking, but it is an efficiency. It's a hugely important efficiency nowadays in markets and marketing. We have coordination failures, coordination in terms of jointly coming to produce or to invest in a product. When you're in a platforms, there's people don't have necessarily the same incentives. Some people want, everybody wants to benefit from high quality, but some people would rather have others invest in high quality and then free ride on those qualities. The centralization of that coordination role in a platform can solve those problems with rules, access rules, with incentives, with things sometimes like reviews. We forget, but having reviews. Amazon was the first platform that introduced reviews for the products. It was hugely controversial, and the shareholders hated it. Apparently, Jeff Bezos had to answer a lot of calls telling him to take that off immediately because people were going to post negative reviews. And how could that be possible? How was that good? But the service was that coordination element. The service of the platform was to make sure that what happened on the platform created value. It was not to just sell products. And you have many examples of tools and investments that are made on the platforms to coordinate the players around the value proposition, a particular technology, a particular offering. You see smartphones promoting, face biometrics as an authentication, for example, which is secure and safe and not hackable. You have, all these solutions are coordinated across the platforms. Innovation is a third one. Systemic innovation, a coordination around innovative solution is something that the platform also solves. Platforms are generally very dynamic innovation spaces with a lot of investment by all involved, not only the platform, but typically platform users tend to innovate more because they have the tools and they have new capabilities and new opportunities that the best of them will act on. And if you act on them, you will be better placed and your position in the platform will be better. So the incentives are there. So ecosystems are complex. They are organization solutions. They're organizations that bring solutions thanks to a technology that was not available before. We are seeing an evolution towards a more networked, complex technology where people interact in that way with more or less decentralized or more or less proprietary systems. It's something that we have to start analyzing and formalizing. We have to formalize the benefit. We have to be able to see them and measure them so we can start now assessing what the impact of conducts or decisions are on the good things that happen on the platform.
Thank you, Elena. Andreas, quick reaction.
Yeah, not much to add. I think Elena described it very quickly. For me, ecosystem theories of harm. So absent specific foreclosure concerns, which of course can be there and can be real and need to be taken seriously. The fundamental problem with ecosystem theories of harm is that, as Elena described so well, they invariably start with improved product quality and consumer benefit. That's sort of the first step, right? So then you need a second step where you move more into the realm of speculation, what could happen, increased market power, blah, blah, blah. But the starting point is invariably there's a better product and consumers will like it. And I think that makes the whole enterprise of ecosystem theories of harm for me very doubtful, and we've seen it also in the cases that you start with something good and then need to sort of more predict what might happen in the future. And I think making this trade-off is just very difficult, and historically actually we have tried not to make this trade-off.
Alexander.
Yeah, so no, I fully agree with the description of Eliana, and I think you contribute very usefully with your paper in a better understanding of those ecosystems. And I think what we need, and I like your question about more or less economic analysis. I mean, I also like the optimism of everyone, because for me, I'm not sure it will be the way, but I mean, I don't know. But what I think we need, and we were discussing that with Eliana during the break, is maybe another type of economic analysis, and that was not part of your question, but with more strategic management, which has studied that a lot. So I think, one thing, and I would be interested to know about the study you mentioned, because when I saw the term of reference as the study, you were referring not only to industrial organization, but to strategic management, financial analysis, and I think that was an opening, which was great from the Commission, because that's exactly what we need. Now the thing is, and again, I will try to see the dangerous side of the things, of the market, is what could be pathologies of ecosystem, which then may justify possibly an antitrust intervention. But I mean, I say that with the full understanding that ecosystem is not like platform, is not like infrastructure, and too often they are equated. And because there are those governance rules which are there. But I mean, there are three main elements in the ecosystem that Anina, you mentioned. There is the modularity of an ecosystem, the complementarity, and the interdependence of everyone in the ecosystem. And I would say that if you see some of those features to be reduced, so for instance, the modularity being reduced or the interdependence being changed into a dependence relationship, then I think that's where that could be a kind of a red flag where the intervention of the authority should intervene. So I think, what you have to see is how the ecosystem evolve over time, and you have to have some red flag, which is to say if the modularity decrease or the interdependence decrease, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily a problem, but at least you have to look at why it's so.
Yeah, and then we have to vote.
No, you go first.
Okay. I don't want to take too long, because then we're going to talk about AI. So if I speak for too long, we're not going to talk about AI.
Guy.
Just so to try to contribute to how we could indeed make it workable, right? So consider ecosystem a bit more in the analysis without creating much uncertainty. 2 points: market definition. And what I'm about to say, I realize will come with a cost. But guess what? I think eventually you're going to have to put money on the table if you want to make the analysis work. Why are there costs involved? Because I would see that for big cases or mergers, a utility in at least documenting the importance that innovation plays in driving the dynamics of the industry outside of the relevant market. There are proxies you can use for that. Not perfect, but there are proxies. Patents, how many apps, R&D spending, VC investment, right? You could also account for the likelihood of disruptive innovation in that industry. How do you do that? Retrospective studies, yes, they are costly, but that's a good start. The second point I wanted to make relates to mergers in the context of ecosystem. There are simple indicators that you can use to assess those mergers to try to see if indeed the target would benefit from the ecosystem or not. This could be post-merger patent output levels of R&D spending, new product launches, more advanced metrics that you can use, resource similarity, you have a huge stream of literature on the subject, innovation persistence, you could also measure that very precisely, and complementarities. there are papers about innovation fitness, which is the ability of a company to raise money that shows that if you do some macro study, that correlates, it's not a causation, but a very strong correlation with the ability of the company to grow in the future. So why don't we take that into consideration when we assess ecosystems? Management, I'm all for it. Just a tiny warning, it could make the analysis very context dependent, right? Because if you find that joining the ecosystem will benefit you because guess what, there are some good managers with the expertise. Well, what if post-merger, those 3 key managers, they end up leaving the company and join another company? Well, the whole analysis, lose relevance. The most advanced you could do, and some agencies are doing it, is to actually train a machine learning system unsupervised, and you could do it in a very specific way with past merger cases. Then you document the effect of what happened on the market after the merger was denied or granted to try to fine-tune those merger simulations. The European Commission has been doing merger simulation for a very long time, and now you see that some agencies are moving toward more unsupervised machine learning in the space, which again requires retrospective studies, but I would see that there are great benefits in doing that.
Me? Yeah, please.
Just one last sentence on market definition, because I think that's key. We know that because this is very much a zero price environment, and one of the evolutions lately in commission assessments, part of the consumer welfare standard is the production of choice. So that the assessment is the objective is that consumers should have choice, and so a caveat here is that there is a tendency, and the DMA is built on that it's this temptation to put choice at every level or every service within an ecosystem. So every layer needs to provide choice, and that drives this very, very aggressive, maybe I won't say aggressive, I don't want to be judgmental, forceful calls for interoperability everywhere. Very strong calls for interoperability without a lot of analysis about where and how and for what. And so I would caution, I think there needs to be a bit of a reconsideration. Do we need it? Do we really need competition, a very granular level of competition? Is innovation at that granular level better than the innovation at an ecosystem level? I'm not sure. And I don't think everybody has proven either way. But we seem to be taking very strong decisions to go one path on one type on innovation and disregarding the other.
Okay, I have a question for you, but you are allowed just to answer yes, no, or plead the fifth. My question seems provocative, but due to the fact that I have a paper on it, and hopefully the referee are not in the room, otherwise go easy on it, but actually, do ecosystem exist in competition law? I mean, as a legal concept. Remember, yes, no, or the fifth.
Yes, 100%. It's in the case law, and it's used by the Commission and other agencies.
Hopefully you are not.
I'm not saying whether it should, but whether it exists, yes.
So that would be a reject of my paper. Alexander.
No, I would say no in the sense that Eliana defined them, and which is, I think, the right definition. So I would say no.
I'm not a lawyer.
Not yet.
I take the fifth.
They do, whether they always are used in the right sense is a different question, but definitely yes.
Okay, no, I have to just get that. Alexander is just the only referee in the room. Okay, Thibaut, let's bring us to the brand new world of AI. Let's make it interesting, at least to me.
Yeah, you didn't ask that I will make it interesting. I wanted to make it very boring. It's the end of the day. You're all thinking about the drinks. Okay, I'll be rather short. So we just talked about ecosystem, and I think it's very helpful to understand AI, and especially generative AI, the whole ecosystem around it. You have those foundation models, GPT-5 and others that you may have played with, and they sit very much at the center of an ecosystem with data, compute, talent, some infrastructures underneath, some apps at the very tops, right? Now, there is a tendency, and I understand why, to look at the whole AI stack one layer at a time. So to say, well, chips, NVIDIA or ASML for the components of the chips, well, we have a market power here by over 90%, therefore there is a competition issue. I think it could be helpful but it's very important to consider how the different layers of the AI stack interact and whether you see that the feedback loops between those layers are negative or positive. I'll give you one example. Last week was released a paper, and it's now all over Twitter, which tells me it has to be real, about tiny recursive models. If you are unfamiliar with the functioning of an LLM, it comes out of a Google paper from 2017 on the transformers. Basically what it does, and I'm sure you've heard of that, when you prompt the system, it generates one word and then think what is the most likely words to follow the first and create a sentence that way. Those tiny recursive models, they do not function the same way. When you prompt the system, it generates a first complete answer and then will actually assess whether the answer makes sense in the context of your prompt up to 16 times. But by doing that, you could actually have equivalent performance with a model that is 10,000 times smaller than if you were to do it with the past technology. So I'm telling you about all that because the design of this foundation model, and yes, this is technical, but very much matters for how many chips you need to acquire to NVIDIA and how many apps will be able to function on top of your foundation models without a huge lagging or waiting time, right? So it shows that you do need some technical expertise and to consider the different interactions between those layers. Now, what we see, and I think what we're going to see, is concentration in the space, and I don't think it's a good strategy to point to Hugging Face, which exists as a platform where you can actually download thousands of foundation models, but who's doing it in the room here, as opposed to who's using ChatGPT or Claude, right? This will be the vast majority. Concentration is not necessarily problematic, but I see two strategies for those companies to actually try to make the ecosystem more robust. That's one way of putting it. The other way is to say, well, to have more market concentration. One is to actually plug applications on top of their foundation models. Now, what's happening is very interesting because 2 years ago, OpenAI announced that they will create a GPT store that still exists. So if you have an account, you go to the left, and then you can actually download apps that are compatible with ChatGPT. And this was a way for them to lock you into their ecosystem. Well, it didn't work. So what ChatGPT or OpenAI is now doing, and this is just 2 weeks old, they are using a technology, MCPs, that's open source, that basically enables any app developers to make their app function with their foundation model without being specifically designed for their foundation model, which is now why now if you use ChatGPT, you could actually prompt ChatGPT, please create a Spotify playlist. And it will do that, right? So you see that there are interesting dynamics, more maybe consumer surplus, but what is it doing to market dynamics? It's something for us to consider. The second one are the partnerships. And actually, I'm tracking what competition agencies are doing in the space. There are over 70 public initiatives in generative AI being put forward by competition agencies. The EU is leading the pack, but if you combine the UK and the US, they are the most active agencies. Most of those agencies are doing market studies as I speak, and the big focus is on those partnerships. A very interesting question to me is whether, because of the partnership, the target can benefit from increasing returns that wouldn't be accessible without the partnership. If the answer is yes, then you have a really strong rationale for actually saying yes to the partnership. Whether it's merger control, it's another question. If the answer is no, meaning that the company could stay outside of the ecosystem without a partnership and still benefit from the very same increasing returns, it's harder to actually justify the partnership. But those are the very two strategies. So again, to come back to the first panel, internal growth in a sense, and acquiring growth by partnerships or mergers that I see in the space.
Thank you, Ivo. I will proceed with Andreas, Eliana, and Alexander.
Thank you. So let me first say, I think that the work that Thibaut and others do in this space is extraordinarily important to just inform future actions. I think this is extraordinarily interesting what you do. From an antitrust enforcement perspective, I do think this is a space where it's useful to go back to sort of true and proven principles, which is look at the overall dynamic in the market. Clearly, this is an extraordinarily competitive market for now. We need to understand it. Market studies, all good, but from an antitrust enforcement perspective, it is extraordinarily competitive. There are real consumer benefits. There are real consumer benefits. I work on a case right now, a complaint, and so reading a complaint. And the first thing that sticks out at you is whatever the complaint is about, it has to start with consumers really like this stuff. So that's important. Another principle that we've used to adhere to was do no harm. So if you really want to intervene, be pretty confident that your intervention actually leads to better outcomes for consumers. And the second, and perhaps another principle is also to say, if you see in the near future real benefit, but then perhaps there's some story about, oh, this could also go in the wrong direction in the future, take the real benefit. So from that overall, going back to true and proven principles, I think as we clearly see the industry structure and everything, we can see, well, maybe this is actually a natural development of the industry, that you have vertically integrated strong players, but it's important to understand, it's important to be vigilant, but from an antitrust enforcement perspective, at the moment, I really don't see that there's too much ground to intervene. Where it will become interesting, and I think that's where also then your research becomes extraordinarily important, is once everyone really tries to make money of it, and this is more than on the upside. That's, and you already mentioned, right, potential for closure, blah, blah, blah. So that's where perhaps antitrust enforcement really becomes important. Once you see people actually trying to make money of this and not just burning billions of dollars every week to develop the stuff.
Yeah, I think I agree with that last point. I think we're in a stage where it's still too experimental to be closed, or I think the incentives now are to spread the technology as much as possible. That's what we're seeing. So we don't, I mean, there's a lot of anxiety, you know, oh, we're going to recreate the, you know, the online services kind of dominance. But for the moment, we don't see, I mean, entry is easy. I mean, access to the required infrastructure is possible. And you see, I mean, I don't think anybody can claim that there's no innovation in that space with models coming out, you know, weekly, if not daily. I actually downloaded models. So, well, I mean, you can't use confidential data on ChatGPT. So if you're working with confidential data, you have to download your model, which is very easy, by the way. It's super easy. Anyway, so but I think that what's going to be interesting and is the partnership space, and particularly I think when traditional companies integrate AI. I think that is, to me, that's the most interesting, because we know that people who do AI, they do AI, they know how to do AI. They're going to build the infrastructure, they're going to produce the apps and the services. But everybody else will have to use AI. And, you know, from cars to architect, everybody. And so what we start to see is that there's a lot of difficulty by traditional companies to absorb AI because the data they have is not AI ready. The processes they have, the management they have, nothing is AI ready, and it takes a lot of capabilities that they probably don't have. So we will see whether internally they transform into AI ready companies, or most likely if they start partnering with people who can deliver those services. And I think that's where you're going to start to see interesting dynamics about whether you know, companies have how that servicing the AI or that absorbing the AI, who are the players, and how what kind of systems they develop, and what, you know, how proprietary those things are going to become. I think that's, for me, the question mark. What's going to happen there?
Alexander.
You know, I agree with what has been said, and I would say everything we said before so would be useful to understand AI. So we have to understand how ecosystem function, because clearly most of those AI are developed within an ecosystem, how innovation function, and to focus on innovation capabilities and see what are the entry barrier to those innovation capabilities. And if they are, I mean, maybe an intervention is warranted, but clearly today it's maybe too early. Also because we have, next to antitrust, and it was mentioned before in the speech of Axel, that antitrust is not everything. First, we have a lot of pro-competitive law already in place in Europe, like regarding the cloud, the data, the AI agent, and so on. So I wouldn't say that there is just antitrust to deal with problem. And also, and that is more a problem for Europe, we have a number of anti-competitive law, which is making the building of those models more complicated. And I would say that at this stage, I will focus more on those anti-competitive law than anti-competitive practice, you know. And the GDPR is, of course, one good candidate. It's not that I'm against privacy protection, but I'm not sure that the GDPR is the most efficient way to do it.
Great. Her Majesty, do we have 10 minutes? Yeah, okay. Thank you. So I would open the floor for a Q&A session.
Yeah. I'll use this one. I want to force you all to go back to the question of ecosystem theories of harm and actually Giuseppe's question about whether ecosystems are a part of competition law. I just maybe hear a little bit more on that, but in particular, I want to know how it differs from vertical integration and or conglomeratization, right? I mean, if the answer, the reason we have ecosystems in competition law is because we know we've dealt with conglomerates before, we've dealt with vertical integration before, and these are the same thing, then I think you can be exonerated, Giuseppe. Because I think what there isn't in competition law is something that defines and helps us understand ecosystems as some unique thing different from vertically integrated conglomerates. If that's what they are, I don't understand how anyone says yes. That we clearly have that concept in competition law, and it's well established.
Do you appoint yourself as a potential referee for the journal?
Yes, absolutely.
Are you writing a book on something?
I don't know what you're talking about.
I can answer from an economic, because I did write a paper on the economics of a new theory of harm from the booking ICLE case. So in that case, the Commission had a novel theory of harm, which is the one that we know. You could interpret that theory of harm as defining an ecosystem in the sense that if it happens, then maybe you have an ecosystem. It's a bit of evasion. But what it said, what the ecosystem generates is what in that case was called the customer acquisition channel. But those concepts are not clearly defined. That's the caveat with that case. So it's kind of the brushes of a theory of harm, but none of the concepts are defined, and none of the necessary conditions are defined for that to happen either. But the idea, as I explained before, is that you have a service, you acquire another service, there is a shared customer base, and somehow these customers, by their own initiative, are more likely to go towards your service. If the acquired service is susceptible to create this new customer acquisition channel, that is a theory of harm.
Is it really different than GE Honeywell?
Well, there is no, but there is no foreclosure here. There is no conduct.
Yeah, but
there is no conduct, right? So it's just.
I agree. I think we sort of. We a little bit we go back to the original sin of conglomerate theory, which was essentially based on an efficiency offense. Now, over time, and that's also from practical experience with the Commission, I think conglomerate theory for a long time became more disciplined in a sense of, okay, is there tying, is there bundling, is there foreclosure related to the additional acquisition of, or the acquisition of additional product lines. But my feeling is also that with ecosystems, we go back a little bit to the idea of this makes your product do good, and therefore there could be future problems.
it is an efficiency offense, but not dynamically. So the argument is dynamically we're protecting barriers to entry. I think a lot of the theories of harm in the platform space really rely on the idea of a barrier of very, very hard or very high barriers to entry. And I think that that's the one thing that needs probably to be revisited a bit more critically, is like how hard, because obviously you're not going to enter with exactly the same service in that space. We're not going to have another Google search or a Facebook search, according to ICLE, or meta search. We're not like that. You will have that action done differently somewhere else with the same result. Now, obviously, with perplexity, AI, you name it, but the whole, even the whole DMA, all the theories of harm in digital really rely on this idea that there will be no one else, right? So it's almost like an essential infrastructure that you have.
Daniel.
I mean, I think it's a question or a provocation. I think when we hear about we want you to go into a more dynamic assessment, right? I hear a lot of what people expect it to mean, but saying you have a case with the Ingrid mentioned them before, Adobe, when you have a monopolist actually, and one of the few, if not the only company that can expand there, and there's a threat that they may do that, or you have a company that is far beyond the range of dominance that acquires a service that can be an access enabler for others to be there in the future. Is it so shocking that somebody takes a bit of a dynamic view and thinks, let's not just think of what this service is today, this complementary service, and it's okay. It's the GE Honeywell, I don't think that you can evolve a switch into an engine, whereas in terms of digital markets, these things can evolve rather quickly. So I would say, well, you look at those decisions and you say, well, that was a pretty dynamic call that was made, right? And isn't that what people expect the Commission to do when they wanted to do a bit of a more dynamic assessment? Or is it just when it's, exculpatory that it's a good thing to have?
Just one sentence. I think that's legitimate. I think those are legitimate considerations. We're not disputing that. It's the assessment maybe that needs a little bit more.
Yeah, that's Facebook iffy, basically, your question. Right.
Andreas, you are willing to jump in?
No, I didn't find this actually so provocative, because I think it's a very good point. So clearly that assessment must be part of it. I think then the next question is, it must be in an equilibrium, so it doesn't say we adopt a dynamic view to find potential harm, but when the companies come and say, okay, here's another story that actually for us makes perfect sense, then they say, well, but the burden of proof to prove that is much, much higher, so we dismiss. But in principle, of course, absolutely. Now, should the dynamic view then go into, now we look into the market and see whether there's another acquirer that could actually be perhaps more attractive to us, that I still have my doubts, despite Alexander's very, very strong defense, but absolutely. And of course, you have to in these markets, because you always have to look what happens tomorrow, but it should be in an equilibrium.
Her greatness, 5:15.
Thank
You
you.
have been just perfect.
You are perfect.
Join me in thanking the panelists.